Hello there, sociologists. I'm excited to announce we're about to start a new topic. It's Unit 4, Area of Study 1, Community. And this is pages 129 and 130 from that SEV textbook. Okay, let's get into it. Our learning goals for today. You're going to know your own thoughts about community. So we're going to do a little activity where you list some communities that you think you're part of. And you're going to know how the concept of community has changed over time. Okay. So, some changes to the concept of community. Community traditionally means social organisations based on small groups, like a neighbourhood or a small town, or a country town. And that comes from Gerard Delanty, a British sociologist. Remember, it's a really good idea to try and drop in the names of as many theorists as you can, okay? However, a more modern meaning of community is that community can also mean membership in a social order. It can also mean commitment, tradition, feeling, or thought. So it's not necessarily a physical community anymore. You know, people talk about a gaming community, stuff like that. So this is Gerard Delanty, the guy who talked about what the traditional meaning of community is. Yeah, what a guy. Here's the dictionary definition of community. So you'll see that it's got heaps of different definitions. You don't need to write this down, but just to get an idea, you know, even defining community, it's not that straightforward. It could be a group of people living in the same area, the same place, a body of nations, blah, 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 blah. There you go. So the two big ones is, one, it's a group of people living in the same place, and two, a feeling of ownership with others. Yeah, so you might have a physical community, like I live in Rye, or like a mental construct community, like a gaming community. Like I'm mates with everybody who follows this Twitch account or whatever. So there have been changes to the concept of community. Now, early on, sociological definitions were dichotomies. So it was either a community, this kind of community, or this kind of community, yeah? A dichotomy is a division between opposites, like black, white, male, female, whatever. So, for example, you might compare a pre-industrial community to an industrial community, or a rural community to an urban community. So you see that they are dichotomies. They're kind of not full opposites, but kind of opposites. But using this dichotomy is useful for sociologists because it simplifies things, yeah? In real life, there's not rural and urban. There's people who live in between. The people who live on the urban fringe. People who live in, when exactly does an urban community become a rural community? There's no exact cutoff there. But using these dichotomies helps us to simplify things, helps us to explain things. Another way to simplify social life is to understand it is what Max Weber called, he's German I think, so he pronounced the W like a V. Max Weber, one of the grandfathers of sociology, he talked about the ideal type. So one way to simplify social life is you imagine this ideal community and then you compare existing communities to their ideal community to see to what extent they are a community, okay? Yeah. This goes right back to the ancient Greeks. They talked about ideal types as well, like Plato did. There are problems with that method. It focuses on the extremes and it overlooks connections between the different communities. Yeah, if you imagined like a perfect rural community and seeing to what extent this community is the perfect rural community, or like a really urban community, to what extent is this community a really urban community? The weakness with that is it doesn't look at the connections between rural and urban communities, which is quite important. So just going back to the topic of dichotomies, here are some examples of dichotomies, yeah? They're kind of like opposites, but in reality you probably sit somewhere between those opposites, yeah? So these are philosophy dichotomies. In philosophy, you're either materialist, you just believe in the material world, you don't believe in God, versus spiritual people. Are you egoistic? Are you altruistic? So on. There are some examples of dichotomies. Here's the guy. This is Max Weber. Yeah, you may have learnt about him if you did year 11 sociology, but he's a dude with a beard, and lots of ideas. Go, Max. So we need just to define a word here for a second, because we're going to need it when we come to some theories in our next lesson. The meaning of the word individualism. It's all about the importance of the individual. It's all about individual freedom and individual choice. And you contrast that with collectivism, where the needs and the interests of the group are more important. So Australia, most of the English-speaking Western countries are very individualistic countries. Yeah, the free rights, the rights of individuals and people being allowed lots of choice is a really big deal in Australian society, for example. Other countries, perhaps more traditional societies or societies with quite a different culture, many traditional cultures in Africa, or perhaps some Confucian societies like China, are more collectivistic. They value the needs of the group more than the individual. Yeah. So individualism and collectivism, that's a dichotomy. Yeah. So the weakness of dichotomies is that you're not really fully here or fully here. You're probably somewhere along the spectrum, which we'll talk about a bit more in a future lesson. Now, the big change to community, and the reason why sociological views on it changed, was because in the 1800s we had this massive thing called the Industrial Revolution. Yeah, sociologists saw huge social upheaval due to the Industrial Revolution. It threatened traditional social bonds. Yeah, so you would often have a personal relationship with, so if you like a rural worker, you would know the person that you work for. You'd have a relationship with your boss, the farm owner, the lord of the manor, whatever. You'd work closely with your friends on that farm or whatever. When people moved to the cities, those traditional bonds broke down quite a lot. There was a huge migration to the cities for work, which was a pretty big deal. It led to a lot of competition between people for jobs and whatnot. The Industrial Revolution saw a big shift from collectivism to individualism as well. Yep. And we see a loss of rural communities. Yeah. So when people move into the cities, generally rural communities are a bit more close-knit. There's less people, and they tend to spend more time together with the same people. So you had stronger family ties, close-knit communities in rural communities, and that begins to break down as people move to the cities because of the Industrial Revolution. So here's an interesting comparison between individualism and collectivism. Yeah. So a really individualistic country is the US. And these numbers down the bottom, I think, are just ranking like how individualistic your country is. So it's all about the individual. You're responsible for yourselves and just your immediate family. Yeah, the nuclear family means just the nuclear, so just the mum, dad, and children, not the extended family, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins. Yeah, your private and your work life are very separate, and you get your pleasure from individual achievement. Whereas on the other end, a collectivist society, it's all about the group. You're responsible for your extended family as well. Your work and your private life are intermixed, and you get pleasure from group achievement. Yeah, those two ends of the dichotomy. And Guatemala is an example of a more collectivistic society than, for example, the US. Australia would be very high in individualism as well, just like the US. So here's a couple of pictures just to give you an idea of what the Industrial Revolution was all about. You may have learnt about it in Year 10 history, but I've no doubt you've forgotten all of it. So this is child labour. Yes, kids this young like this would, be forced, they'd be dragged out of bed by their parents at 5 a.m. and put in a car, made to go to work. They would work 12, 13-hour days, 7 days a week. Not much fun. So, yeah, your life might be hard, but I can guarantee you it's not as hard as it was for a worker in a European factory during the Industrial Revolution. Yeah. More people living in factories, so there was factories set up all over the place and people moved to them. And here's some people working in a factory. There's some women working in a factory. There you go. Right, so a quick overview. Okay, your activity today. I want you to think about 3 different communities that you feel like you belong to. They can be physical communities, or they can be immaterial communities? Do you belong to the Australian community, the Lebanese community, the Islamic community, the gaming community, the gay community, all different types of communities that you might belong to? And for those three communities that you feel like you belong to, I want you to give at least one reason why you feel like you're a part of that community. Yay! The video for today is called Community and Society. Take it away.
Hello and welcome to 25 Concepts in Anthropology, where I, Nick Herriman, take you through what I think are the top 25 concepts in anthropology. Each of these concepts provides a unique way with which to understand the world and what it is to be human. Today I'm going to look at the concept of community and society. Society is famously known as Gesellschaft and community as Gemeinschaft. This comes from the German scholar by the name of Tönnies. What do these words mean? Well, society and Gesellschaft refers to a form of human organisation, a social order if you like, that is based around written laws. The other kind of social order is community or Gemeinschaft, and this is based around tradition and spoken mores and spoken ways. So one social order we'll call society or Gesellschaft, and that's based around laws. The other social order we'll call community or Gemeinschaft, and that's based around tradition and spoken mores. Now, if we look at Gesellschaft or society for the meantime, the form of authority in society is a state, typically, a bureaucratic organisation which regulates and administers citizens' rights and interests. That's the major form of authority in society. By contrast, in community, authority is far more diffuse. It might be, for example, the local elders or the priests. Society, so you might have guessed already, is a form of social order which develops particularly in the West from about 1800. By contrast, community predates the modern era. The other distinction we could make is that society has tended to predominate in urban areas. By contrast, community has tended to predominate in rural areas. Now, within society, there is another form of society which we call civil society. So if you like, in Gesellschaft, society that is, there's another form of society which is called civil society. And this is a combination of like political parties, the media and press, unions, NGOs, etc. And these are thought ideally to provide some form of political representation for the citizens and is a kind of counterweight to that of the state. That's society. What about community? The basis of community, basis of social organisation in community is kinship and locality. What I mean is your relationship with your uncles and cousins, etc., and also your relationship with your neighbours. Now, another interesting phenomenon, or another interesting factor in society is the development of the idea of nation. As we understand it, the modern nation is a relatively new concept. We can find biblical references to a nation, nation of Israel, etc. But the modern sense of a nation, that is, a group of citizens whose rights and obligations are administered by a state whose power is counterweighed by that of civil society, is a very new idea, and nation is part of that. As Benedict Anderson famously wrote, a nation is an imagined community. In other words, I'm Australian and I will never be able to meet everybody in Australia. I have to some extent, imagine them. And Benedict Anderson argues that there were certain factors associated with modernity that allowed the development of this idea of nation. An idea that's very important to me and probably very important to you. It's probably one of the most taking ideas, the most captivating ideas of modernity. By contrast, in community, typically we meet everybody in the community. It can be imagined, we can imagine the whole village, for example, or the whole clan, but we can also meet everybody in the village, meet everybody in the clan. We can know them on a face-to-face basis. So that's another big difference between society or Gesellschaft on the one hand and community or Gemeinschaft on the other hand. As I've already hinted, in society, the basis of society is the individual citizen. Is the individual citizen who has bonds which are legalistic. They are moderated by the state. So if your car crashes into me, you and me don't fight directly. We fight, if you like, via a state. Now, that's our relationship, if you like, is mediated by the state. In community, it's different. There are personal bonds. We have to come together, sync together as kin, family in some way or another. Now, at the very basis, if you like, society, this modern social order that's only developed really from about 1800 onwards, is based around mass economy. And typically that mass economy takes the form of capitalism. By contrast, in Gemeinschaft or community, the basic economic relationship is one of reciprocity, which is where we exchange things face to face and not via a market. So if you like, economically, you, the listener, and I are economically connected through a market. Now, if you and I lived in a community, our relationship would be direct, unmediated by a market, and based on principles of reciprocity. They're the basic outlines of society and community. If you're watching this, I'm guessing you probably live in society, so you're quite familiar with it. If you live in a community, you know there are different kinds of forms. As I mentioned already, there's clan, there's also caste, and most famously is village community. Now these two concepts, society and community, have been very useful, particularly from about 1900 to 1950, because there was a division of labour. Sociology focused on society, while anthropology took as its proper object of discussion to be community. So sociology was society, anthropology was community. That's up to about, let's say, the mid-20th century, so around about 1950, up to that point. After then, a lot of famous anthropologists, foremost amongst them Geertz, became interested in developmental anthropology, the anthropology of development. And basically what they were trying to chart was the societies which they were doing participant observation fieldwork. They were trying to chart the transition from community to society, from tradition to rational thought, from magical beliefs to a sort of religious beliefs. They sort of saw themselves as tracking this path from ritual to, let's say, scientific action, from community to society. So this is sort of became popular in the 1950s and the 1960s. Following that, from the 1970s on, the whole idea of community and particularly tradition becomes heavily criticised, and this criticism is associated with post-structuralism. In other words, post-structuralist authors challenged us, and they said the idea that anthropology has created of a static community, timeless, at peace with itself, that living in tradition, post-structuralism said, no, this is just a fiction that's been created by anthropologists. And to some extent that's true. Some of the things that we thought of as traditional were in fact things that have been a product of the modern era. Nevertheless, the distinction is still quite useful, I believe. There are two ways in which you can see it's useful. One, in the nation in which I do field work, which is Indonesia, you can see a phenomenon which is sometimes called the urban village. What that means is that in parts of this huge megapolis, this huge city, there are little, they call them kampung in Indonesian, which means something like compounds. So it'll be a compound with a lot of people from the village where I did field work, and they will go back and forward from my fieldwork village to the capital city and back, to the capital city and back. And while they're in the capital city, they'll stay with people from my fieldwork village too, or let's say more generally my fieldwork area. So I can go to the capital city and meet with them and kind of live a village life in the city. And that's in fact what they do. They live, if you like, a community or Gemeinschaft style life in the city. And this is interesting for us as anthropologists, because we assume that the society would predominate, that the social order called society would predominate in urban areas. And I still think the idea is very useful in parts of the world which are supposedly modern or Western. In many parts of rural Australia, for example, social relations are easily analysed in relation to community. And so, particularly in rural areas, we can see community as a form of social order still affecting people in their everyday lives. And this is why I think this distinction between community and society is a very useful one and provides us with a unique insight into what it is to be human. Stay tuned for more concepts in anthropology.
Your reflection activity today is the good old 3-2-1. So I want you to list 3 things you learned, 2 things you found interesting. I hope you found 2 things interesting, and 1 question that you still have. Homework. Fun times. Very easy. You just got to find 4 images. I want you to find 2 images that represent community to you. And I want you to sketch them in your exercise book. And then I want you to find 2 images that represent the opposite of what you think community means, and sketch them in your exercise book as well. Yo, for those of you that are keen as beans, it's time for some bonus homework. Read those 2 pages from your textbook. It's always a good idea to do that bonus homework. It's not much reading. And remember Crash Course Sociology? There's an episode about community. It's called social groups. Some of the terminology they use is a little bit different to what's in this course, but the woman who presents it's fantastic and it's really educational. So it's about 10 minutes. I suggest you check it out. Thank you so much for taking part in today's lesson, and as I always like to say, keep it real.